My parents refused my newborn after my car accident, and my mother told me to figure it out from a cruise line. I was broken, bleeding, terrified, and then I realized what she'd really been taking from me for years, and what her choice would cost her forever in silence. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. My name is Tessa Holloway, and I'm in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and I need you to listen close because this isn't one of those family drama stories where everybody's just a little messy and then they hug it out at Christmas. This is the kind of betrayal that makes you stop believing in the whole idea of blood is thicker than water. Because when I was lying in a hospital bed with a shattered leg, a shoulder that wouldn't sit in its own socket, and a newborn at home who still smelled like milk and warm laundry, my mother didn't say, "I'm coming." She didn't say, "Tell me what you need." She didn't even say, "I'm sorry." She said, "Figure it out." And then she walked onto a cruise ship like she was stepping into a spa brochure. I remember the exact sound of it too, the boarding line announcements echoing behind her, the clink of champagne glasses like little celebratory bells, and the foghorn in the background like the universe itself was mocking me. And I'm telling you right now, if your jaw just tightened, if you felt that heat behind your eyes, I want you to hold on to that feeling because it gets worse before it gets clearer. And I want to ask you something up front because I already know the comments are going to split into two camps. Did my mother cross a line that can't be uncrossed? Or do you still believe parents get a permanent pass just because they're parents? Sit with that while I take you back to the moment my life flipped from normal Tuesday to absolute chaos in under 10 seconds. October 3rd, 2:47 p.m. I left the veterinary clinic where I work billing and insurance, the unglamorous job that keeps the lights on and the rent paid, and I left early because our neighbor, Mrs. Rigsby, was watching my 7-week-old baby girl, Callie, and she had a dentist appointment at 5. My husband, Mason, was about 45 minutes away in Elizabethtown installing an AC unit in some commercial building, sweating through his shirt for people who complain about the thermostat being 1 degree off like it's a national emergency. The plan was simple, and that's the part that still burns, because it's always simple right before it becomes a nightmare. Pick up Callie, start dinner, wait for Mason to get home. Maybe watch something mindless because newborn life is basically survival plus laundry. I remember the intersection too, Scottsville Road and Campbell Lane, because once you almost die somewhere, that place stops being a street and starts being a scar. My light was green, and I know it was green because I had that split-second thought you only have when you're doing something routine, like, okay, green, go, don't hit the brakes too hard. And then I heard it, not saw it, heard it. This heavy engine roar sliding into my world like a freight train that missed its tracks. I turned my head just enough to register a brown FedEx truck coming straight into my driver's side like the laws of physics didn't apply to him. People always say time slows down, and I used to think that was movie nonsense, but it's real. I remember the exact sound of metal folding, glass popping, my own breath leaving my body in one ugly gasp. My 2014 Ford Focus, with 127,000 miles, didn't stand a chance, and neither did my bones. The impact shoved my door into my hip, and it felt like someone hit me with a sledgehammer, and then set me on fire. My shoulder yanked hard like it was being torn out by an invisible hand. And then everything spun. Not the dramatic kind, the nauseating kind, like your brain is trying to keep up but can't, and the world becomes a blur of gray sky, asphalt, and the inside of your own car. When I came to, I wasn't in the car anymore, I was in an ambulance, and I knew that before I opened my eyes because of the smell, that sharp, clean hospital smell mixed with rubber gloves and something metallic that I realized later was my own blood. The pain wasn't just pain, it was white-hot, blinding, a straight line of fire from my hip down to my knee, and every breath felt like a knife sliding between my ribs. A paramedic kept saying my name, "Tessa, stay with me, don't move, you're doing great." And I wanted to scream at him because I wasn't doing great. I was falling apart, but I couldn't get the air to do it. All I could think about was Callie. Callie at home. Callie hungry. Callie crying. Callie needing arms, and my arms were useless. They told me later my right femur was fractured bad enough to need a metal rod. My left shoulder was dislocated. 3 ribs cracked. But in that moment, all I could see was my baby's face in my mind like a little beacon, and I kept trying to ask, my baby, but it came out like a whisper because my chest hurt too much to make real sound. They took me to the medical center in Bowling Green, room 412, and I'll never forget that number because it's where I learned how quickly family turns into a word people use when it's convenient. The doctor came in with that calm, professional voice doctors have, the voice that's trying not to scare you while they say terrifying things. He explained surgical repair, recovery time, physical therapy, and then he said the sentence that changed everything. You will not be able to care for an infant alone. It wasn't an opinion. It was a fact. And it meant we were about to drown unless someone threw us a rope. I called Mason first. He answered on the second ring, and when I told him what happened, his voice cracked in a way I'd never heard. Not angry crack. Not annoyed crack. Pure fear. He said, I'm coming right now. I'll figure out work. Just hold on. And he did. He drove that 45-minute distance in a way I don't even want to imagine. He made it by 5:15, and he wasn't alone. He had Callie in one arm, my tiny baby wrapped in a blanket, and he held my hand with the other, like if he let go I'd disappear. He looked like he hadn't breathed since my call. And this is the part people don't talk about when they romanticize strong husbands. Strong husbands still have bills. Strong husbands still get punished by jobs that treat humans like replaceable parts. Mason could take 5 days off. 5. Unpaid, because HVAC work doesn't come with generosity, and if he missed more than a week, they'd hand his jobs to someone else and act like it's just business. Our mortgage was due on the 15th, $1,340. We had about $4,000 in savings. And I hadn't even had surgery yet, and the math already didn't add up. We sat in that room with the beeping monitors and the stale hospital air, and I watched my husband do calculations on his phone like he was trying to solve a puzzle that had no solution. That's when I called my mother, Renee Holloway, 59 years old, remarried to a man named Gordon who worshipped her, living in a beautiful 4-bedroom house in Louisville that she treated like a photo studio for Facebook. The same mother I'd been sending $400 to every month for 3 years for property taxes. The same mother I gave $2,800 to 3 months earlier for an emergency roof repair she swore she'd pay back. I was the daughter who showed up. I was the daughter who didn't make trouble. I was the daughter who helped. And I truly believed in that hospital bed that it would finally come back to me. She answered on the 5th ring. The first thing I noticed was noise. Not hospital noise. Not home noise. Vacation noise. Music. Chatter. That airy, excited sound people have when they're somewhere they want to be. I explained everything, and I didn't sugarcoat it. I told her I'd been hit, that I needed surgery, that I couldn't walk, that my shoulder was out, that my ribs were cracked, that my newborn needed care, that Mason could only take 5 days, and that I needed her to come to Bowling Green for a week or 2, just long enough for me to stand, just long enough for me to hold my own baby, without risking dropping her. And right here, before I tell you what she said, I want to ask you something, because this is where people reveal who they are. If your adult child called you from a hospital bed and said, I can't walk and I have a 7-week-old baby, what would you do right now in real life, not in theory? And while you're thinking, do me a favor and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you're in the US, what state, because I want to see how many of us are carrying the same kind of family scars in different zip codes. Anyway, my mother didn't gasp. She didn't say my name with concern. She sighed. An irritated sigh, like I'd asked her to pick up groceries when she was already comfortable on the couch. She said, "Tessa, I'm in Miami. We're boarding." And I could hear it, the line moving, the announcements, that little pause in her voice where she was half paying attention to me and half paying attention to her vacation. She told me it was a 12-day spa cruise to the Bahamas. She said it like she was telling me about a once-in-a-lifetime award. Then she hit me with the guilt math, like money mattered more than my bones. "Do you know how much these tickets cost? Do you know how long I've been looking forward to this?" I remember staring at the ceiling tile above me, staring at a little stain shaped like a smear, and thinking, this can't be real, because in my mind, mothers don't negotiate when their child is broken. I said, "Mom, I can't walk. I have a newborn. I need help." And then she said the words that made something in me go quiet and hard at the same time. She said, "Your sister Paige never puts me in these situations."
Paige.
My younger sister, the golden child, the one who could crash a car into a church, and my mother would probably apologize to the church for being in the way. And then my mother said, "Figure it out." Like I was asking for a ride to the mall. Like I wasn't lying there with a leg that needed metal and a baby who needed arms. She told me she couldn't cancel. She said they were calling her boarding group, and she hung up. And I swear to you, I could still hear the ship's horn after the call ended, like it echoed into my bloodstream. I lay there with morphine in my arm and my leg in traction, and the weird part is the morphine didn't touch the hurt that mattered. The physical pain was awful, yes, but the emotional pain was clean and sharp, like a blade that didn't even wobble. Because in that moment, I realized something. My mother wasn't confused. She wasn't overwhelmed. She wasn't helpless. She chose. She chose the cruise. She chose the photos. She chose the self-care captions. She chose a vacation over her injured child and newborn grandbaby without blinking. And while I was in surgery with a metal rod being driven into my femur, she was probably holding a flute of champagne on a deck chair, smiling for a picture. While I was learning how to use a bedpan because I couldn't stand, she was getting a seaweed wrap and posting about how she deserves peace. While my husband was trying to be a full-time worker, a new father, and a caretaker all at once, sleeping 3 hours a night, she was acting like my emergency was an inconvenience to her itinerary. And the moment I watched her first cruise photo pop up on Facebook from my hospital bed, with a caption that said something like "Self-care isn't selfish," I felt the shift. Not a break.
A shift.
Like a bone setting into a new position.
Permanent.
And right then, I didn't know what I was going to do about it, but I knew I wasn't going to be the woman who quietly figures it out for people who won't even show up. Because the next thing that happened wasn't just a money problem or a childcare problem. It was the beginning of a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for years, and the first clue didn't come from my mother at all. It came from someone who had no reason to protect her and no reason to lie to me, and when I heard it, I realized my mother's cruise wasn't even the ugliest part of what she'd done. The next 48 hours taught me something brutal, not in a dramatic I learned a lesson way, but in a very practical, very humiliating way, like learning you can't trust a chair right after you sit down, and it snaps under you. Mason stayed those 5 unpaid days, and I watched him turn into 3 different people without ever leaving my bedside: husband, father, and crisis manager. He'd pace the room with Callie tucked against his chest, bouncing her gently while trying to keep his voice low because the nurses were in and out, and the monitors kept chirping like impatient birds. He'd lean over me and whisper, I'm here. And I believed him, but belief doesn't pay a mortgage, and it doesn't change diapers at 3 a.m. when your wife can't sit up without crying. When the surgeon came in to explain the procedure, Mason asked questions like he was studying for an exam he didn't want to take. How long would the rod be? What were the infection risks? When could I bear weight? What would physical therapy look like? What would my pain management plan be? How soon could I hold my baby without my shoulder slipping again? And I'll never forget the surgeon's face when he said, carefully, "She can't lift with that shoulder, and she can't stand with that leg. You're going to need help at home." The way he said help wasn't casual. It was a warning. But my mother had already made her decision, and Paige had already laughed at me on the phone like my broken body was an inconvenience interrupting her reality TV. So we had to manufacture help, like building a bridge out of toothpicks while the river rises. Mason pulled up a notes app and started listing what we'd need. Someone at night, so I wouldn't try to get up alone and collapse. Someone to help with Callie's feeding schedule. Someone to wash bottles and keep the house from becoming a biohazard. Someone to make sure I took meds on time, because pain makes you forget everything except the pain. Then he opened our banking app, and I watched his face go tight the way it does when a man realizes he can't muscle his way through math. We had $4,200, and that number felt like a joke once you turned it into days. Hospital copays, prescriptions, gas back and forth, formula just in case, diapers, mortgage, utilities, and then childcare help, which turns into a second mortgage all by itself. The nurse practitioner gave us a pamphlet for home health services and rehab, and I remember the paper shaking in Mason's hand because he was holding Callie and trying to read at the same time, and Callie was making these tiny little squeaks like she was arguing with the world for existing, and it hit me so hard, I almost got nauseous. My baby had no idea her survival depended on adults who were failing us on purpose. I had surgery early the next morning, and the hours before it were this strange limbo, where your body is already broken but your brain keeps trying to bargain. I stared at that ceiling tile stain again, and the morphine made it swim, and I kept thinking about my mother's voice saying "figure it out," like it was a command, like I was a malfunctioning appliance. When they wheeled me down the corridor, the fluorescent lights passed over me in a steady rhythm, like a metronome counting down my old life. In the operating room, the anesthesiologist asked me to count backward, and I remember thinking, if I don't wake up, Callie will grow up with a grandmother who posts cruise photos and a mother who couldn't make it home. I woke up with my leg wrapped and heavy, like it wasn't fully attached to me anymore, and my throat dry from the tube, and pain that came in waves under the medication, like the ocean hitting rocks. The nurse told me the rod was in, the surgery went well, and then she said, "Don't try to get up." She said it twice. And when I had to use a bedpan for the first time, I felt my dignity leave the room and close the door behind it. Mason helped the nurse position me, and he kept his face neutral, but his ears were red like he was embarrassed on my behalf, and I wanted to cry because I didn't want my husband's strongest memory of new parenthood to be me broken in a hospital bed. The first night, Callie wouldn't settle. She was overtired and confused, and the hospital smells and sounds made her restless. Mason rocked her in the corner, and I watched him through half-lidded eyes, watching him sway like a tree in a storm, whispering nonsense baby talk. Hey, you're okay. And then his phone would buzz with work messages, and I saw the life draining out of his shoulders. On day 2, we got the official discharge timeline, and it wasn't good news dressed up as hope. 6 to 8 weeks minimum before I could function independently, longer if complications hit. That's when Mason asked, "How much would a night nurse cost?" And the case manager gave us a list like she was handing us a restaurant menu. I hate how normal the system is about desperate situations like, "Yes, ma'am, here are your options for not losing your mind." At 2 a.m. that night, while Mason slept with Callie curled on his chest in a hospital recliner because he was too exhausted to fight her into the bassinet, I used my one good arm to scroll through caregiver profiles. It felt unreal, like online shopping for oxygen. I found a retired NICU nurse named Lila Grant, 67, from Elizabethtown, and her bio said she handled emergency situations and complicated families, and I stared at those words, complicated families, and I swear it felt like she'd written them specifically for me. Her rate was $28 an hour. 10 hours a night was $280. 1 week was nearly $2,000. And I did the most sickening calculation of my life. The cost of being abandoned by your own mother. Because if my mother had shown up for 2 weeks, we wouldn't have needed a stranger. Instead, we were paying out of fear. Lila started the next night. She walked into my room like she'd done it 1,000 times, calm, practical, eyes scanning the scene the way a seasoned nurse reads a chart. She asked where the baby supplies were, where my meds were, where my phone was, where the call button was, what my pain scale really was, not the polite one, the honest one. Mason looked like he could have kissed her shoes. Lila didn't do pity. She did competence. And she also did something else, something I didn't expect. She asked one pointed question that made my stomach drop. She said, "Where's your mother?" I tried to laugh it off, like it was a harmless quirk. "On a cruise." Lila paused, just one beat, and said, "That tells me everything I need to know." And then she went right back to work, like she was sealing a file in her mind. The next few days were survival by 1,000 tiny humiliations. We canceled things that made us feel normal. I canceled our anniversary dinner reservation without even telling Mason at first because it felt stupid to mourn a dinner when I couldn't stand. But then I cried anyway because normal life was slipping away. Mason's birthday was coming up, and I'd already bought him the cordless drill set he'd been wanting for a year, and I returned it for $173, standing at the customer service counter on crutches later, pretending it was no big deal, while inside I felt like I was pawning our joy. Then I sold something I swore I'd never sell, my late grandmother's pearl earrings. They were the only thing I had left from the one woman in my family who treated love like an action, not a slogan. A woman drove up from Nashville, handed me $180 cash, and smiled like she'd scored a bargain. I smiled back like a liar, and then sat in my car and stared at the steering wheel because I wasn't ready to feel what that trade really meant. And every time I opened Facebook on my hospital Wi-Fi, there was my mother, Renee, on a deck chair, cocktail in hand, captioning her photos with those smug little quotes about deserving peace, as if peace is something you steal from your injured daughter and then frame as self-care. It made me want to throw my phone, but I couldn't even lift my shoulder without pain, so I just stared and let the rage ferment. On day 4, I tried one more time to create Help Out of Family because part of me still wanted to believe this was a misunderstanding, that maybe Paige would surprise me, that maybe she'd show up and prove me wrong. I called her, and she answered like I'd interrupted something sacred. I could hear Game's show clapping in the background. I gave her the short version, no theatrics, just facts, and she laughed, this little snort, like I told her the punchline before the joke. She said, "Tessa, I'm not a baby person." And then she said she was going through something and needed to focus on herself. I asked what, and she told me her boyfriend from a vape shop had dumped her, and she said it like it was a funeral. And in that moment, something in my brain snapped into focus, so cleanly it felt like putting on glasses for the first time. My mother and my sister weren't helpless. They weren't confused. They just had a different rulebook for me. I was the one who handles it. I was the one who sacrifices. I was the one who gives money and time and patience, and in return I get a candle with a clearance sticker and a lecture about not being dramatic. And then the worst part happened quietly. Mason's 5 days ended. He stood at my bedside on the morning he had to go back, trying to act steady, but his eyes looked haunted, and he kept rubbing Callie's back like he was apologizing to her with his hand. He kissed me, kissed the baby, and walked out to go fix rich people's AC while I lay there thinking, if I drop my baby, if I fall, if something goes wrong in the night, it's because my own mother chose a buffet and a spa wrap over her grandchild. And just when I thought I'd hit the bottom of what betrayal could look like, Lila, the night nurse, leaned in close as she adjusted my pillow and said, almost casually, "Your stepfather doesn't know, does he?" And the way she said it wasn't a question about feelings, it was a question about facts. Like, She already suspected someone was lying, and then my phone rang a few hours later, and the name on the screen was the last person I expected to be the first crack in my mother's story. The name on the screen said Gordon, and for a second my brain didn't even register it because I still thought in old labels like Mom's husband and the quiet guy at holidays, the one who carved the turkey while Renee directed traffic like a general and Paige critiqued everybody's clothes like she was a judge. I answered with my heart in my throat, and I kept my voice careful because when you grow up around a mother like Renee, you learn that every conversation is a courtroom and every word is evidence. "Hello," I said, and Gordon sounded polite in a way that almost made me angry because politeness is what people use when they're about to step over your pain without noticing. "Tessa, hi, it's Gordon," he said, and then he cleared his throat like he was embarrassed to exist in the middle of this. "I just saw a post. Colleen shared something about you being in the hospital. Renee told me you had a little fender bender. Some soreness. I didn't know you had surgery." And there it was, the first clean crack in my mother's story. Not from me yelling, not from me begging, but from a simple adult question meeting a lie and realizing it didn't fit. I stared at the white hospital wall and felt this weird calm come over me, like my body finally accepted that I wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding, I was dealing with a strategy. Renee didn't just refuse to help, she edited reality, so she could refuse without consequences. "It wasn't a fender bender," I said, and I could hear the machines in my room beeping like they were counting seconds. "I broke my femur. I dislocated my shoulder. I cracked ribs. I can't walk. I can't lift my baby. I had surgery. They put a rod in my leg." Gordon went silent, and then he exhaled in a way that sounded like someone deflating a balloon slowly so it wouldn't pop. "Jesus," he whispered, and you know what? That whisper felt more motherly than anything Renee had given me in years. He asked where I was, which hospital, which room number, and before I could stop myself I said it automatically, like a child still trained to be cooperative. "Bowling Green Medical Center, room 412. He said he could drive down, it was 2 hours, he could be there by dinner, and I almost laughed because he said it like showing up was the default response to someone being shattered. Imagine that. Showing up. I told him no, not because I didn't want help, but because I could already see how Renee would twist it. If Gordon came, Renee would act like she'd offered all kinds of support, and I'd refused it. She'd turn my boundaries into my punishment. So I told him the truth in the cleanest way possible. "I appreciate you," I said, "but I'm handling it. Mason's doing what he can. We hired a night nurse." Gordon sounded ashamed. "Renee never mentioned any of this," he said, and then he tried to patch it with, "She's been stressed." Stressed. The word people use like it's a permission slip. I didn't argue. I didn't attack him. I just said, "I need to rest." And he said, "Of course. Please tell me if you need anything." When I hung up, Lila was standing near the four-pole, and she didn't look surprised. She gave me that same experienced nurse stare that says, "I've seen this movie in 1,000 different homes." "He didn't know," she said softly. "No," I answered, and my voice came out flatter than I expected. "He didn't know." Lila adjusted my blanket, and then she did something that felt like a small blessing. She didn't ask me to forgive my mother. She didn't ask me to understand her. She didn't do that tired advice older people sometimes give where they act like betrayal is just a personality quirk. She said, "Okay, now we plan like she's not coming. Because she's not." And that sentence did two things at once. It hurt and it freed me. The next day, Mason came in after work smelling like dust and metal and sweat, the smell of a man trying to hold a family together with his bare hands. He looked at me, looked at Callie, looked at the hospital bills sitting in a folder on the tray, and I watched him swallow anger like it was too expensive to spend. "Your mom call?" he asked. I shook my head. "No." Gordon did. Mason's eyebrows lifted. Gordon. I told him what Gordon said, and Mason's jaw tightened. He didn't insult Renee out loud, but I saw the insult in his face. So she lied to him, he said, and there was no question in it.
It was a statement.
And then he said something that made my stomach drop, because it was the most realistic thing in the room. If she lied to him, she's lying to everyone. That's when my phone started doing that thing I hate, buzzing with family texts that are really just surveillance disguised as concern. My Aunt Colleen texted, "Honey, how are you holding up?" My cousin texted, "Praying for you." And then, an hour later, another text from a different relative, "I heard you're really milking this accident. Don't let bitterness ruin your marriage." I stared at that message like it was written in a foreign language.
Milking it.
As if anyone would choose a fractured femur and bedpans and selling heirlooms for gas money as a fun little attention hobby. I called Colleen, and she answered on the first ring like she'd been waiting. Her voice was gentle at first, but there was steel under it. "Tessa," she said, "I'm so sorry. Your mother is telling people you're exaggerating. She's saying you're dramatic, that Mason has it handled, that you're trying to guilt her." I felt my pulse thump in my ears. "So she's not just absent," I said. "She's rewriting me." Colleen hesitated, and when she spoke again, her tone changed. "I need to come see you," she said. "In person." I asked why, and she said, "Because there are things you need to know, and I should have told you a long time ago." That line hit me harder than any insult because it sounded like the kind of sentence that opens a door you can't close again. Colleen showed up 2 days later at the rehab facility because they transferred me out of the hospital and into this bright building where everyone pretends walking is just a mindset. My physical therapist, a cheerful guy named Trent, acted personally offended by my broken leg like it was a rude inconvenience, and he kept saying, "We're going to get you back," with that sunny voice that makes you want to scream. Colleen came in carrying a casserole dish like a classic auntie, and then she carried something else that made my mouth go dry. A manila folder so thick it looked like a secret had been stapled into it. She set the casserole down untouched, sat in the plastic chair beside my bed, and she didn't smile. She looked guilty and determined all at once. "Before I say anything," she said, "I need you to promise you're not going to call Renee right now." "Not yet." I stared at her. "What is this?" I asked. Colleen took a breath, like she was about to jump off a cliff.
"Your dad," she said.
"When he passed, there was a life insurance policy." The room went quiet around us, even though I could hear other patients shuffling in the hallway. I blinked. "My mother told me there wasn't anything," I said slowly. "She said the funeral ate it all." Colleen's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. "That's what she wanted you to believe," she said. "The policy was for his kids, not for her. Split between you and Paige." My hands went cold, and I felt that familiar sick feeling, the one you get when you realize the person who raised you has been playing chess while you've been playing checkers with your eyes closed. "How much?" I asked, and Colleen swallowed.
80,000, she said.
40 for you. 40 for Paige. I stared at her like she'd told me gravity wasn't real. $40,000 doesn't vanish into an $8,500 funeral unless someone makes it vanish. I tried to speak, and my throat tightened. "Paige got a car," I said, and I heard my own voice shake. 6 months after Dad died. Paid cash. She bragged about it like it was a flex. Colleen nodded once. "Yes," she said. "She got hers." The silence between us felt like a trapdoor opening. I whispered, "So where's mine?" Colleen reached into the folder and pulled out copies of the policy documents, clean, official, black and white proof. She slid them toward me, and my vision blurred because pain medication and betrayal do not mix well. "He gave me copies before he died," she said. "He told me, If anything seems off, tell my girls. And I tried to ask Renee after the funeral. I tried. And she threatened me. My head turned slowly toward her. Threatened you how? Colleen's jaw tightened. She said if I kept asking questions, I'd be cut off from the family. No gatherings. No holidays. No birthdays. Like I'd never existed. Colleen looked down at her hands. And I'm ashamed to say it worked. I stayed quiet. I felt anger rise, but it didn't land on Colleen. It landed where it belonged, like a dart hitting the center of a target I'd been pretending wasn't there. Renee didn't just play favorites. She enforced silence. She ran the family like a little kingdom where the currency was guilt and access. Colleen leaned in closer and lowered her voice. There's more, she said. I don't know exactly where your money went, but I know this. Renee once bragged she had an account Gordon doesn't know about. A secret safety net. My stomach dropped so hard it felt like my ribs hurt all over again. And right there, in that rehab room with the fluorescent lights and the plastic chair and the untouched casserole, my brain started connecting everything like a detective finally looking at the right suspect. The $400 a month I'd been sending, the fake roof emergency, Paige's debt rumors, the way Renee always had a reason she needed money, but never had receipts, and now, a missing inheritance. I looked at you, the viewer, in my mind, because I know some of you have lived a version of this, and I need you to answer me honestly. If this was your mother, would you confront her immediately, or would you get quiet and get strategic first? And also, while you're here, tell me where you're watching from because I want to know how far this kind of family behavior spreads. Is it just Kentucky drama, or is it nationwide? Colleen tapped the folder gently, like it was a loaded weapon. You need to move carefully, she said. Your mother will turn this into you attacking her. She'll make you the villain. I stared at the documents again, and the weirdest thing happened. I didn't feel heartbreak anymore. I felt clarity. Like my whole life had been blurry, and someone finally wiped the glass clean. I whispered. She stole from me, and Colleen didn't correct me. She didn't soften it. She just nodded. And in that nod, I realized something bigger than the money. Renee wasn't just refusing my newborn in a crisis. She was refusing accountability in every season of my life, and the accident didn't create the betrayal. It exposed it. I slid the documents under my pillow like they were oxygen, and I told Colleen, send me certified copies. Everything you have. Colleen nodded again. I will, she said. And Tessa, there's one more name you need to be ready for. Who? I asked, and she hesitated like she hated the answer. Paige, she said. Because she knows more than she's pretending. And that was the moment I stopped thinking of this as a sad family story and started thinking of it as a controlled operation, because if my sister had accepted her 40 grand while I got nothing, then the next conversation wasn't going to be polite, and the next move wasn't going to be emotional, it was going to be surgical. Colleen left, and the room felt louder after she was gone, like the air itself was gossiping, the hallway footsteps, the distant TV. The squeak of Trent's sneakers as he paced outside like he was warming up to wrestle my femur back into cooperation, and I laid there staring at those insurance pages under my pillow like they were a Bible verse I'd been denied my whole life. And I kept thinking about one thing that people don't talk about enough, especially older folks who were raised on respect. Your parents. Respect is not a blank check, and love is not a license to steal. And yet Renee had been treating motherhood like a lifetime membership card that let her do whatever she wanted and still demand applause for it. Mason came back in that evening with Callie's diaper bag slung over his shoulder, eyes red, jaw tight, and he didn't even sit down at first. He just stood there looking at me like he was trying to memorize my face in case something else got taken from him, and I said, Colleen came, and he blinked like the words didn't compute. And I pulled the documents out from under the pillow and slid them across the blanket the way Colleen slid them to me, slow and deliberate, like handing someone a weapon you hope you never have to use. Mason read the first page, then the second, then the part with the beneficiary split, and I watched his hands change. That tiny tremor you get when anger is trying to climb up your throat and you're forcing it back down because there's a baby sleeping in the next room and you don't want your voice to shake the walls. 40,000, he said, more to himself than to me. And then he looked up, and his eyes did that thing men do when they're trying not to cry because they don't want to scare you. She told you there was nothing. I nodded. She told me the funeral ate it. Mason let out a laugh that wasn't funny. A funeral doesn't eat $40,000, he said, and then he sat down hard in the chair like his knees suddenly got too tired to keep holding his body up. So Paige got hers, he said, and I heard the certainty in his tone because we both remembered Paige's shiny used SUV, the one she'd posted on Facebook with the caption "Manifestation Works," like Dad's death was a vision board. I swallowed and said the part that made my stomach feel like it was full of ice. Colleen thinks Renee hid mine in a secret account Gordon doesn't know about. Mason stared at me, and then he looked at the rehab room, the bland walls, the weak lighting, and he said, "So what do we do?" And that question right there, that's the moment where old me would have gone emotional, would have called Renee to scream, would have demanded a confession like reality TV, and then Renee would have cried, played victim, called relatives, and by the end of it somehow I'd be apologizing for being robbed. I could feel that old reflex trying to wake up, the urge to explain myself, the urge to be fair, the urge to keep the peace even if the peace was just me bleeding quietly so everyone else could eat dinner comfortably.
But something in me was different now.
The accident didn't just break bones, it broke my obedience. "We don't call her," I said. Mason frowned. "Not yet," I added. "We build a file." I said it like I was at work, like this was a billing dispute, because honestly that's what it was, a dispute with the woman who'd been overcharging me emotionally for years, and now she'd taken it into actual dollars. Mason leaned forward. "Okay," he said. "Walk me through it." So I did, and I'm going to walk you through it too, because if you've ever been financially manipulated by family, this is the part where you stop being a victim and start being organized, and I know that word sounds boring, but organization is the most underrated form of revenge. First, I asked Colleen to mail certified copies of everything she had, not photos, not screenshots, certified copies, because screenshots are easy to dismiss and certified paper hits different. Then I opened my phone and I searched my bank history right there in bed with my one good arm, and I found every $400 transfer I'd sent to Renee over the last 3 years, and the numbers stacked up like bricks, and it made me sick because it wasn't just money, it was time, it was trust. It was me believing I was helping my mother keep her home when her home was a 4-bedroom showpiece and mine was a mortgage on a working man's paycheck. Next, I pulled up the text messages about the roof repair, the $2,800, the promises to pay me back, the little heart emojis she used like frosting on a lie, and I took screenshots and I emailed them to myself, and then I printed them at the rehab office because paper can't be lost the way a phone can glitch. Mason watched me do it and said quietly, "You're calm." And I told him the truth. "I'm not calm," I said. "I'm controlled." That night, after Kelly finally fell asleep and the rehab facility lights dimmed, I called the insurance company number on the document, and I put it on speaker, and I told the rep my father's name, and I gave the policy number, and I gave my own information, and my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and the rep confirmed it in that polite corporate voice that makes life-changing facts sound like weather. "Yes, ma'am," she said. The policy paid out in April 2021. 2 checks issued. Both checks cleared. I swallowed. "To whom?" I asked. She hesitated like she wasn't allowed to say it. "I can confirm the beneficiaries," she said carefully, "but we cannot disclose the endorsement details without a formal request." That was enough. It meant the company believed I had been paid. It meant in their system I'd already gotten my share. And I hadn't. Which means somebody endorsed a check that wasn't theirs or rerouted it or forged something, and that's not family drama. That's fraud. I ended the call and stared at the ceiling. And Mason whispered, "So she really did it." And I nodded, but what I didn't say out loud yet was the part that scared me the most. If Renee stole from me once and got away with it, she didn't just do it because she needed money. She did it because she enjoyed the power of it, the thrill of getting away with it, and people like that don't stop unless they're forced. The next morning, Trent had me do a painful little walk with a cane, and he clapped like I'd won a marathon, and I wanted to tell him the only reason I was walking was because rage is a powerful physical therapy plan, but instead I smiled and said, "Thank you, because pattern interrupts matter. You can be plotting and still be polite to people who actually show up for you." Later that day, my phone buzzed with Paige's name, and I stared at it like it was a rattlesnake, because Colleen's words kept repeating in my head. Paige knows more than she's pretending, and I asked myself, if this was your sibling, would you pick up, or would you let it ring to see what story they tell when they can't control you? I picked up. "Hey," I said, and Paige's voice came in bright and fake sweet, the tone people use when they're checking your temperature, not your well-being. "Oh my gosh, Tess. I just heard you were still in rehab," she said, and I could hear a TV in the background and a bag crinkling like she was snacking while asking about my broken bones. "Mom said you're doing better, though," she added quickly, like she needed Renee's version to be the official one. I didn't argue. I didn't correct. I just asked the simplest question in the world, the kind that sounds harmless but pulls the thread on a sweater. "Paige," I said, "did Dad have a life insurance policy?" Silence, then a tiny laugh. "Why are you asking that?" she said, and there it was, not denial, not confusion, just deflection. I kept my voice gentle.
"Just answer it," I said.
She sighed like I was annoying her. "Yeah," she admitted, "but it was handled. Mom handled it." "Did you receive money from it?" I asked. Another beat. Then she said, "Tess, don't do this right now. You're stressed. You're on pain meds."
Pain meds.
The universal gaslight. If you're too calm, you're cold. If you're too angry, you're unstable. If you're medicated, you're unreliable. That's how people like Renee and Paige keep the game rigged. I leaned back against the pillow and stared at the rehab room door like it was a witness. "Paige," I said slow, "did you receive $40,000 after Dad died?" She exhaled hard. "I got money," she said. "I don't know the exact number." "Yes, you do," I said, and my voice didn't rise, because I wanted her to feel the difference. I wanted her to feel that I wasn't begging anymore. "You bought a car cash," I added. 6 months after. You posted about it." Paige got defensive fast.
"So what?" she snapped.
"Dad wanted us taken care of." "Exactly," I said, and I let the word hang in the air like smoke.
"Us."
Another silence, longer. And then Paige said the line that told me everything. "Mom said you didn't need it because Mason had a job." I felt my throat tighten, and I swear I could taste metal, like my body recognized betrayal as a physical substance. "She said that," I repeated. Paige rushed in, trying to patch it. "She didn't mean it like that. She just meant you were stable." Stable. As if stability means you deserve less love. As if being responsible is a punishment.
I didn't yell.
I didn't cry. I didn't call her names. I just asked one last question, and you tell me if this is where Paige crossed the line or if she crossed it years ago. "Paige," I said, "when Mom told me to figure it out while I couldn't walk and my newborn needed me, did you think that was normal?" Paige hesitated, and then she said, "I'm not getting in the middle." And that's when I knew the truth about my sister. She wasn't neutral. She was invested, because neutrality in a robbery always favors the thief. "Okay," I said quietly. "Thanks." And I hung up. Mason was watching me, and he said, "What did she say?" I looked at him, and I said, "She confirmed it." And then I said the part that made Mason's face go pale. "Renee told her I didn't need my share, because you work." Mason stared, and then he whispered, "So my job is the reason she stole from you." "No," I corrected. "Your job is the excuse she uses to justify stealing from me." And in that moment, I made a decision that felt like stepping onto a bridge that would burn behind me. I wasn't going to confront Renee with emotions. I was going to confront her with math, with dates, with receipts, with one demand she couldn't wiggle away from. And then my phone buzzed again, and this time it wasn't Paige. It was a text from Renee herself, bright as a billboard, like nothing had happened. "Hi, sweetheart. Just checking in. Hope you're feeling better. Love you." And I stared at that text and felt something cold and almost amused spread through me, because the timing was too perfect, like she'd already heard from Paige, and was moving to control the narrative before I could. I looked at Mason and said, "She's about to ask for something," and Mason said, "How do you know?" And I told him, "Because she only remembers I exist when she's about to collect." And right as I said it, the phone rang, and Renee's name lit up the screen like a warning label, and I answered, and her voice came in syrupy sweet, the exact tone she used when she was about to pretend we were a normal family, and she said, "Tessa, honey, I heard you've been making calls about your father's policy." And I smiled without joy because she tipped her hand, and I said, "Yes, I have." And she paused, and then she said, "Why would you do something like that?" And I realized this wasn't going to be a fight, it was going to be a negotiation, and I was finally holding the only thing she feared, the truth. Renee said, "Why would you do something like that?" in that syrupy tone, like I'd just committed a social crime, not uncovered an actual one, and I looked at Mason sitting there with Callie's bottle in his hand, his eyes fixed on me like he was ready to jump in front of a bus for me if he had to, and I realized something that hit me like a second collision. Renee wasn't afraid of what she did. She was afraid of being seen doing it. Because people like that don't fear God, they fear witnesses. So I kept my voice calm, almost bored, the way you talk when you're not asking permission anymore. "Because I'm a beneficiary," I said, "and I never received my portion." Renee did that fake inhale, the one that's supposed to signal heartbreak, and then she went straight into the oldest trick in the book. "Tessa, you know your father's passing was a hard time for me," she said, and I could almost hear her preparing to drape herself over the conversation like a funeral shawl. "There were so many expenses, so much paperwork. You were grieving. I handled it because you couldn't." I let her talk. That's important. Let them build the lie all the way, because the longer they talk, the more they trap themselves in details they can't defend later. "I'm not saying you didn't handle paperwork," I said when she paused to breathe. "I'm saying a policy paid out and my check cleared according to the insurance company, and I never got it, so we need to address where it went." The silence on the other end got sharp. Then she tried the next move. "Who told you this?" she snapped, because that's always their first concern. Not the truth, but the leak. "Colleen." She said my aunt's name like it tasted sour.
I didn't bite.
"The insurer confirmed payout and clearance," I said, "and I have policy documents." Then she pivoted to the next weapon, attacking my stability. "You're still on medication, aren't you?" she said, like she was asking about the weather, like my pain management made me legally imaginary. "You've been through a lot. You're not thinking clearly." That made Mason's jaw flex, and I touched his knee with my fingertips, a silent signal. "Not yet. I'm thinking clearly enough to keep a baby alive with one arm and a broken leg," I said, "and clearly enough to read documents." Renee went quiet again, and then she turned her voice sweet, almost whispery, like she was leaning in at church. "Sweetheart, why are you doing this?" she said. "You're going to stir up the whole family." There it was. Not denial. Not confusion. Threat disguised as concern. I decided in that moment I wasn't going to debate the whole history. I wasn't going to argue about the monthly $400 or the roof repair or the favoritism or the cruise ship humiliation because that's the mud she wants. She wants you in the swamp where everything is complicated and feelings and misunderstandings. I wanted a courtroom clean sentence. I want my inheritance, I said. That's it. She laughed, and it wasn't friendly. Inheritance, she repeated, like I'd said I wanted a unicorn. Tessa, you have a husband. You have a home. Paige doesn't even have stability. She said it with such casual cruelty, like she was reading off a grocery list. And that's when I knew deep down she didn't steal out of need, she stole out of hierarchy. In her mind, love wasn't love, it was allocation. My father didn't leave money to stability, I said. He left money to his daughter. Renee's voice hardened. You're accusing me of stealing, she said, and I didn't flinch. I didn't use that word. I said. You did. There was a pause, and I could hear faint clinking in the background like she was in the kitchen, like she was living her normal life while mine had been rearranged around a cane and a baby monitor. Then she went for the guilt hammer, the one older generations know too well. After everything I've done for you, she said, this is how you repay me. I almost laughed not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. Repay. Like she'd been investing in me. Like motherhood was a loan. I pictured a ledger in my mind and Renee sitting at the top like a banker, charging interest on affection. Mom, I said, this isn't repayment. This is restitution. That word made her inhale again. Don't use those legal words with me, she snapped. And there it was again, fear of witnesses, fear of records, fear of anything that doesn't melt under tears. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling tile, the same tile I'd stared at for weeks while she was on a deck chair. Then let's keep it simple, I said. I'm requesting one amount. She immediately tried to widen it. Oh, so now you want money for raising you, she scoffed. You want to bill your own mother? I refused the bait. One amount, I repeated. The portion that was meant for me. She tried to talk over me. Your father would be ashamed, she said. That one stabbed because it's designed to, especially for people who still love the dead more than the living. But something in me was steady now, like a door had finally locked. My father was careful, I said. He named beneficiaries. He made copies. He trusted Colleen with them. That tells me he was worried about this exact conversation. Silence again, and this one wasn't theatrical. It was calculating, like she was scrolling through options in her head. Then she changed tactics to bargaining. How much do you think you're owed? She asked, like it was negotiable, like she was haggling at a yard sale over my father's wishes. I had already decided my number because multiple numbers gives her room to argue. One number corners her. 31,500, I said. That's my portion after funeral costs. And I'm being generous. Renee's breath caught, and for the first time her voice slipped, just a little, revealing the panic under the polish. I don't have that kind of money sitting around, she said quickly. I didn't respond right away. I let her sit in it. I let her feel the weight of saying it out loud. Then I said the sentence I'd been saving, the one Colleen's little comment at Christmas had loaded like a bullet. I think you do, I said. I know about the account Gordon doesn't know about. You could hear the air change. The background noise stopped. Even her breathing sounded different, shallower, like the truth had wrapped a hand around her throat. What are you talking about? She whispered. She didn't sound angry now. She sounded scared. That's when I knew I'd hit the real nerve. I kept my voice level, almost gentle, because when someone is scared, they reveal things if you don't spook them. The emergency fund, I said. The rainy day money you bragged about. The one that's yours. Another long silence. And I could practically see her mind racing through damage control because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about her marriage, her image, her control. "Who told you that?" she hissed. There it was again. The leak. Always the leak. "It doesn't matter," I said. "I'm not calling to argue. I'm calling to resolve." Renee's voice snapped back into anger like a mask. "You're blackmailing me," she said. "No," I said. "I'm giving you a timeline." I laid it out slowly, so she couldn't pretend she misunderstood. "You have 30 days, I said. If I receive $31,500 within 30 days, this stays between us. If I don't, I contact an attorney, and at some point Gordon will see documents with your name on them. I'd rather you tell him than a court." She tried to flip it. "You're going to destroy this family," she spat, and I felt that old instinct to defend myself rise, and then I squashed it, because the best defense against manipulation is refusing to accept the premise. "You can't destroy what was already rigged," I said. "You broke it. I'm just refusing to hold it together with my own body anymore." Renee started crying, or at least she made the sounds of crying, and maybe a few real tears came. I don't know, but I know this. They always cry when the strategy fails. "You're doing this while you're injured," she sniffed. "What kind of daughter does this?" I pictured Callie, my baby, and I pictured her grown, and I pictured myself stealing from her and then asking her what kind of daughter dares to notice. It almost made me nauseous. "A daughter who finally learned the difference between love and control," I said. "That's what kind." Renee's voice turned icy. "Fine," she said. "I'll see what I can do." And I could hear it in her tone that she wanted me to celebrate, to say thank you, to soften, to give her an exit ramp where she still felt powerful. I didn't. I said, "I will expect it in writing." And she snapped, "You don't get to make demands." And I answered, "I do when my name is on the policy." And then I ended the call before she could pull me back into her theater. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from adrenaline, like my body had just survived a storm. Mason exhaled and said, "Are you okay?" I looked at him, and I told the truth. "No," I said, "but I'm awake." Then my phone buzzed, and it was Paige texting me, not even asking how I'm healing, just one line. "Mom is crying. What did you do?" And that right there told me the next wave was coming, because when the main manipulator loses control, the flying monkeys get deployed. So I opened my notes app and started a new list called Timeline, and I wrote the date and time of Renee's call, and the exact words she used, and the exact threats she implied. And I did it like I was documenting a patient chart, because that's how you beat a liar. You don't argue, you document. And then, as if the universe wanted to prove my point, a new call came in from a number I didn't recognize, Louisville area code, and when I answered, a man's voice said, "Hi, this is Gordon." And my stomach dropped, because that meant Renee hadn't just started damage control. She had started covering tracks, and whatever story she was telling him was already forming. And I was about to find out whether he was calling as a decent man trying to understand, or as her hired defense attorney wearing a husband's voice. Gordon's voice was polite in that careful, measured way men get when they're trying to stay calm but their whole world is wobbling, and he said, "Tessa, I'm sorry to call you out of the blue, but Renee told me you two had a misunderstanding." And the word misunderstanding landed like an insult, because you don't misunderstand a life insurance payout. You don't misunderstand who a beneficiary is. You don't misunderstand a check being cashed. And yet that's exactly how she framed it, like I was being dramatic again, like my broken leg and my newborn were just background noise to her main character energy. I didn't answer right away, because I could feel Mason behind me in the living room, pacing in socks like a guard dog trying not to bark, and I could hear Callie's soft little sleep sighs coming through the baby monitor like a reminder of what matters. Gordon cleared his throat and said, "She's pretty upset. She said you threatened her with legal action, And I could hear it, the subtle loaded tone, like he wanted me to deny it so he could relax. And I wanted to, I really did, because older folks watching this know exactly what I mean when I say confrontation fatigue, that exhaustion where you just want peace even if peace is basically you being eaten quietly. But then I pictured Renee on that cruise boarding line telling me to figure it out, while I could barely breathe. And then I pictured her smiling at Christmas while my money was missing, and I decided no more peace purchased with my silence. Gordon, I said. I didn't threaten her. I gave her a timeline to return money that belongs to me. He went quiet, and then he said, "What money?" Like he genuinely didn't know, and in that one question I could tell he was not in on it the way Renee was. He was the audience member who just got dragged onto the stage. So I kept it simple and factual because facts don't slur or stutter. My dad had a life insurance policy, I said. He named me and my sister as beneficiaries. 40,000 each. The insurer confirmed both checks were issued and cashed in April after he died. My sister received hers. I didn't receive mine. The silence on his end turned heavy, like a man picking up a suitcase and realizing it's full of bricks. Renee told me there wasn't any money, he said slowly, like he was repeating something he'd been told for years and only now noticing it doesn't make sense. She told me funeral expenses swallowed everything. I let out one breath, slow, so I didn't sound like I was shaking. Funeral costs were around $8,500, I said. I even contributed $2,000. Even if you subtract that, there's still a large remainder that should have gone to me. Gordon said, That's not what she told me. And I could hear something cracking in his voice. Not anger, not yet. More like confusion turning into suspicion, like his brain was doing math he didn't want to do. Then he asked the question that told me he'd already started digging. Did you receive a check from Renee for $31,500, he said. And I knew right then he had seen that withdrawal. He had seen my name on something, and Renee had already tried to paint over it with a lie. Yes, I said, and I didn't add emotion. I didn't add victory. I just let the truth sit there like an anvil. She sent it after I requested my inheritance. Gordon inhaled through his nose, long and sharp, and said, She told me it was for Paige. Dental work. I didn't laugh, but I did blink hard because it was so classic it was almost comedic, the way Paige is always the excuse, always the alibi, always the reason I'm supposed to swallow my own pain politely. It wasn't for Paige, I said. It was made out to me. Then he said, Why would she lie to me? And listen, if you've been married a long time you know that question is layers, because he wasn't just asking about a single lie. He was asking whether his entire marriage had been built on a version of Renee that never existed. I could have softened it. I could have protected her like I used to. I could have said, maybe it was a misunderstanding. Because that's what good daughters do when they were trained to be the family sponge. But then I remembered the bedpan, the rehab facility, the marketplace earrings, the mortgage math, and how Renee didn't just abandon me. She tried to rewrite me as the villain to the whole family. Gordon, I said, I can't tell you why she lies. I can tell you what is true. And then I told him one more thing because I was done holding secrets that were never mine to carry. She also told people I exaggerated my injuries, I said. She told people I was playing victim. Gordon's voice dropped. She said you were fine, he said, like he was putting together why he'd never visited the hospital, why he'd never brought soup, why he'd never even met his step-grandbaby during the worst moment. She said it was a fender bender. Mason stopped pacing behind me, and he looked at me like he wanted to take the phone and say a few words himself, the kind you can't take back. I covered the mouthpiece for a second and whispered, Let me handle it, and I went back to Gordon. I wasn't fine, I said. I had surgery. I couldn't walk. I couldn't lift my baby. We paid a night nurse out of savings. We sold things. I returned gifts. I sold heirlooms. And that's when Gordon did something that made my stomach knot, because he whispered, almost to himself, "Oh my God," like he was seeing Renee in a new light, and he didn't like what he saw. Then he asked, "Do you have documentation?" And that's the moment where everything turned from family drama into a full-blown unraveling, because a person who asks for documentation is not trying to soothe feelings, they're trying to confirm reality. "Yes," I said. "Policy documents. Beneficiary listing. Insurer confirmation. Dates." I didn't mention Colleen yet because I didn't want to drag her into the blast radius, but Gordon already sounded like he was standing in a room full of smoke and looking for the fire. "I'm going to ask her to show me her records," he said, and his voice was calmer now, which was scary because calm meant decision. And then he said, "Tessa, I'm sorry." And when he said that, I felt something strange, not relief, not comfort, but validation, because for the first time in this entire mess, a grown adult was looking at me and saying, "Yes, this happened, and yes, it was wrong." I told him, "I appreciate you saying that." And then I added, "I never wanted to blow your marriage up. I wanted my father's wish honored." And he said, "I understand." But he didn't sound like he understood in a neat, tidy way. He sounded like a man realizing there is no tidy ending. Then, right before he hung up, he said, "One more question." And my chest tightened because one more question is never just one more. "Did Renee ever mention having an account I don't know about?" he asked. That was the moment. That was the match over the gasoline. I didn't answer right away because I could feel the old fear, the instinct to protect the mother who never protected me. And I want you watching to tell me honestly, what would you do right there? Would you tell the truth and let the chips fall? Or would you keep the peace one last time even if it burns you later? Because I'm going to be real with you. I stood there staring at the baby monitor like it was a judge, and then I pictured Callie older, asking me why I kept letting people treat me like a disposable ATM, and I knew my answer. "Yes," I said quietly. She mentioned an emergency fund, a rainy day account, one that was hers. Gordon didn't yell. He didn't curse. He just went silent for so long, I thought the call dropped. Then he said, "Thank you," in a voice so flat it sounded like grief, and he hung up. I stood there holding my phone like it weighed 100 pounds, and Mason finally spoke. "That man is about to go home and look at his whole life like a crime scene," he said, and he wasn't wrong. Because within an hour, Renee started calling. First my phone, then Mason's, then my work number. Then she left a voicemail that was all sobs and rage stitched together. "You ruined everything," she cried. "You turned him against me.
You always hated me.
You're jealous. You're ungrateful." And the wildest part is how fast she flipped from misunderstanding to "you ruined my life," because that's how you know it was never about me being confused. It was always about her being caught. Paige texted next, a full novel on my screen, telling me how I'm tearing the family apart and how Mom did what she had to do. And I read it twice because I couldn't believe a grown woman could watch a mother steal from one daughter to fund the other and still call it love. I didn't reply. I walked to the kitchen slowly with my cane, poured water, and my hands were shaking so much I spilled it on the counter, and I just stood there watching it drip, thinking, isn't it funny how you can survive a literal car crash and still get taken out emotionally by a person with a Facebook smile? That night, after Callie finally fell asleep, Mason opened his laptop and said, "If we have to, we're ready." And he pulled up a simple folder he'd made called Proof, and inside were screenshots, bank transfers, timestamps, the rehab bills, the Care.com payments, the marketplace messages for the earrings, the insurer's confirmation, and I realized he'd been quietly documenting too, not because he was petty, but because he loves me in the way parents are supposed to love their children. Protective, practical, present. And then, as if Renee had a sixth sense for calm, another call came in, not from her, but from a number I recognized, my Aunt Colleen, and when I answered she whispered, "Tessa, I need you to listen, because Gordon just showed up at my house, and he's asking questions Renee cannot answer, and I think she's about to do what she always does when she's cornered. And my stomach dropped because I knew exactly what she meant. When the truth is closing in, Renee doesn't confess. She detonates, and the next move she made was the one that finally exposed what she'd really been refusing all along, and it wasn't just my baby, it was accountability. Colleen's whisper turned into a crackling kind of panic, the kind you hear in older women who spent their whole life smoothing trouble and suddenly realize the fire is already in the curtains, and she said, "He's here, Tessa. Gordon is standing in my foyer with his coat still on, and he keeps asking the same question like he's afraid of the answer." And I gripped my phone so hard my knuckles went white because I could already picture it. Gordon with those neat, responsible man habits, holding his keys like a weapon he doesn't know how to use, trying to act calm while his brain does the math. "What question?" I asked, even though I already knew, and Colleen swallowed and said, "He asked if Renee ever cashed a check that wasn't hers, and then he asked if she ever threatened me, and then he asked me if I knew about any separate account. And I swear to you, I saw his face change when he said those words." I sat down on the edge of the couch, the cane leaning against the coffee table, and Mason came over and lowered the TV volume without me asking because he could tell the room had turned serious. "Colleen," I said, "don't get pulled into her mess. If you don't want to answer, don't." And Colleen surprised me because her voice firmed up like a backbone finally clicking into place. "Honey," she said, "I'm 80% guilt and 20% casserole. I've been pulled into this mess since before you were born. I'm done being scared of Renee." And then she added something that made my stomach twist. "Renee called me 10 minutes before he arrived." My heart dropped. "What did she say?" I asked. Colleen exhaled hard. She said, "If you tell him anything, I will make sure the whole family knows you've been poisoning them against me." And then she said, "You'll die alone." And I know that sounds dramatic, but she said it like she said it before. I closed my eyes because there it was, the same script, the same bully logic, the same way she controls people, not with love, but with fear of isolation. And if you're watching and you've ever dealt with someone like that, you know the main tool isn't yelling, it's the threat of being cast out, like family is a club and they're the bouncer. I opened my eyes and looked at Mason and said quietly, "She's trying to burn Colleen now." And Mason's jaw clenched so tight, I could see the muscle jump. Colleen kept talking, low and fast, like she was unloading a secret she'd carried too long. "Gordon asked me if you were really hurt," she said, "and I told him the truth, and he looked like he'd been punched. Then he asked me why Renee told him it was a fender bender. And I said, because she didn't want you to come help. And he said, 'Help who?' And I said, 'Her daughter and her granddaughter.'" I felt tears sting, not because I was sad, but because it was so validating it almost hurt, hearing another adult say the sentence I'd been living. "Is Renee there?" I asked. "Not yet," Colleen said, "but Gordon called her, and she said she's on her way." And then Colleen's voice sharpened. "Tessa, you need to know something. When Renee is cornered, she doesn't admit. She accuses. She picks the softest target, and she attacks until everyone forgets what the original question was." I stared at the baby monitor, Callie's tiny chest rising and falling, and I said, "So what do we do?" Colleen said, "We don't argue. We anchor. We stick to the proof." And I almost laughed because it sounded like something you'd say during a tornado, but it was exactly right. Then, as if the universe wanted to prove Colleen's point, my phone buzzed with a text from Paige, and it was the kind of message that tries to sound innocent while holding a knife behind its back. "Hey sis, Mom's really upset. Gordon is overreacting. Can you just tell him it was a misunderstanding so he calms down?" I stared at it, and my first thought was so loud it felt like a shout. Overreacting. A man discovers $31,500 moved out of his joint account, and his wife lies about where it went, and he's overreacting. And you know what that is, right? For anyone watching who's lived long enough to recognize patterns, that's not a sister asking for peace. That's a co-conspirator asking you to cover the tracks. I didn't reply. Mason leaned over and read it, and he said, "They're trying to make you the patch for the hole they cut." Then my phone rang. Renee. And I didn't answer. Not because I was scared, but because I finally understood the trap. If I answered, she'd flood the line with emotion. She'd cry. She'd guilt. She'd scream. She'd pull out after everything I did for you. And she'd try to get me to say one sentence she could twist later. So I let it ring. Then she called again. Then she called Mason. Then she called again. Like an aggressive telemarketer, except instead of selling you a warranty, she was selling you her version of reality. Finally, she sent a voice note, and I played it on speaker because Mason was right there, and I refused to be alone inside her storm. Renee's voice came through sugary at first. "Tessa, honey, please call me back." And then you could hear the flip, the quick pivot into anger. "You're destroying this family. Do you hear me? Destroying it. Gordon is humiliated. Paige is devastated. Everyone is talking. And for what? Because you want to dig up something from years ago. Because you always have to be the victim." Mason shook his head, slow, like he was watching a magician reveal the trick. She kept going. "And Colleen, that bitter woman, she has always hated me. And I swear if she is filling your head with lies." And then the voice note cut off because she hit the time limit, which felt like mercy. I sat there breathing slow, and I realized something that might hit some of you right in the chest. She never asked how I healed. She never apologized for abandoning me. She never asked about Callie. She didn't even say, "I'm sorry you felt alone." It was all optics, all reputation management, like my pain was an inconvenience to her image. That's when Colleen texted me a single line, "She's here." My stomach tightened, and I said to Mason, "I'm going to Colleen's," and he immediately said, "No, you're not going alone," and he was already grabbing his keys. We moved fast, but carefully because my leg still wasn't right, and the whole drive over I kept thinking, I can't believe a car accident is what finally exposed my mother. But that's how it goes sometimes. Trauma doesn't just break you. It reveals what was already cracked. Colleen lived in a modest ranch house, the kind with a wreath on the door and a porch light that always works. And when we pulled up, I saw Renee's SUV in the driveway parked a little crooked, which told me everything about her mood. Gordon's car was behind it, perfectly straight, because of course it was. We walked up the path, and I could hear voices through the door. Not yelling yet, but that tense, clipped talking where every sentence is a weapon wrapped in polite paper. Colleen opened the door before we knocked, and her face looked pale but determined, like she decided she'd rather be honest than comfortable. Inside, Gordon was standing by the fireplace with a folder in his hand, and Renee was on the couch in her. "I'm a victim," posture, shoulders hunched, eyes glossy, hand on her chest like she was auditioning for daytime TV. The moment she saw me, she snapped, "Oh, here she is, the star of the show," and then she looked at Gordon and said, "See, this is what I deal with. She thrives on drama." Gordon didn't even look at her. He looked at me and said, "Tessa, I'm sorry you're going through this." And that simple sentence made Renee's face tighten because it wasn't centered on her. She tried to interrupt. "Gordon, you don't understand." And he raised his hand, not aggressively, just firmly, and said, "Renee, stop. I asked you a direct question, and you gave me 3 different answers." Then he turned back to me and said, "Did you receive a check from Renee for $31,500 on December 19th? And I nodded and I said, "Yes." Renee jumped up like the couch was on fire. "It was to help her," she blurted, and then she corrected herself. "I mean, it was always meant for her. It was just a banking issue." And Colleen made a sound, a tiny laugh, not even mean, just disbelieving, like she couldn't take the performance seriously anymore. Renee whipped toward her. "Don't you dare," she hissed. And Gordon, bless that steady man energy, opened his folder and pulled out a printout. "This," he said, tapping it, "is the bank statement showing the withdrawal from our joint account. This, tap, is the image of the cleared check made out to Tessa. And this, tap again, is your text to me claiming it was dental surgery for Paige." He looked at Renee and said, "Why did you lie?" Renee's mouth opened and closed like a fish, and then she did exactly what Colleen warned she would do. She attacked. "Because you're embarrassing me," she cried, eyes flashing to me. "Because she's manipulating you. Because she's always been jealous of Paige. Because she thinks the world owes her something." Gordon didn't take the bait. He looked exhausted, older in the eyes. "Renee," he said quietly, "this isn't about jealousy. This is about money you moved and lied about. It's also about why you told me your daughter's injuries were minor while she was in surgery." Renee turned bright red and she snapped, "I didn't want you involved." And then she froze, realizing she'd admitted it, and that tiny slip was the moment her whole mask cracked. I looked at her and said, calm as ice, "You didn't want him involved because you didn't want him to see you refuse your own daughter. And I want you watching to answer this in your head, and if you're brave, say it in the comments later, because this is where the moral line lives. Is a parent still a parent if they only show up when it benefits their image and then disappear when it costs them something real?" Renee took a step toward me like she wanted to intimidate me, and Mason stepped in front of me without saying a word, just a simple protective move, and Gordon watched that and swallowed hard, because he saw it too. He saw the difference between love and control. Renee's eyes darted around the room, calculating, and then she grabbed her purse like she was about to storm out, but Gordon's next sentence stopped her cold. He said, "Before you leave, I want to know one more thing. Do you have any bank accounts I don't know about?" Renee's face went blank for half a second, and that half second was louder than a confession, and Colleen, with the courage of a woman who finally chose truth over belonging, said, "Raymond warned me, Renee. He said you'd try something." Renee spun, and the room went silent, and I realized we were standing at the edge of the real reveal, the one that wasn't just about my inheritance, but about how long she'd been running this game, and exactly what else she'd taken, and from who. Renee's eyes flicked to the door like she was measuring escape routes the way some people measure calories, and Gordon stood there with that folder in his hand, calm on the outside, but I could see it in the way his fingers tightened around the paper, like he was trying to hold his whole life together with staples and banker's clips, and he said again, slow and clear, "Renee, do you have any accounts I don't know about?" And Renee did what she always does when the trap is tight. She tried to turn the room into a courtroom where she's the wounded saint. She pressed her hand to her chest and said, "I can't believe you're interrogating me like I'm a criminal." And Colleen, bless her, didn't flinch this time. She didn't soften it. She didn't cushion it. She just said, "You threatened me for asking about Raymond's policy, Renee. You did that." And Renee snapped back, "Because you were stirring trouble." And Gordon's head turned sharply. That was the moment he realized this wasn't one misunderstanding. It was a pattern, a system, a lifestyle. I stood there behind Mason, feeling the old reflex rise in me, the reflex to smooth it over, to say something polite so nobody's voice gets too loud. And then I looked at my cane leaning against Colleen's end table, and I remembered the sound of that cruise horn in my ear, and I remembered the way Renee said, "Figure it out," like I was a stranger calling the wrong number, and something in me went quiet and strong. Gordon opened the folder and pulled out a second page, and he said, "I called the bank to ask about a transaction history discrepancy," and Renee's face twitched. "Gordon, why would you call the bank?" she barked, and he said, "Because you lied to me." And he didn't raise his voice, which somehow made it worse for her because she couldn't paint him as the aggressor. He slid the page forward on Colleen's coffee table, and I saw it. Black ink on white paper, clean and boring. The kind of proof that doesn't care about tears. A small monthly transfer, consistent, same day, same amount, that had been leaving Renee's personal savings account for years. Renee lunged toward the paper like she could erase it with her hands, but Gordon held it down with 2 fingers and said, "This account," and he looked her straight in the eyes, "is not listed on our household financial disclosure. It is not linked to our joint planning, and you have been moving money in and out of it while telling me you don't have anything separate." "Explain that." Renee's lips parted, and for the first time all night, she had nothing ready. No script. No villain. No shortcut. Just the truth standing there with its arms crossed. And then, because people like Renee can't sit in silence, she tried a new angle. She tried to justify it like a lifestyle tip. She said, "Every smart woman has an emergency fund." And then she added, "Hank always handled everything. I just wanted security." And Gordon blinked hard. "My name's Gordon," he said. And that tiny correction hit like a slap because it reminded everyone she didn't even respect him enough to stay present. Colleen cleared her throat and said, "Raymond told me he didn't trust you with money." And Renee snapped, "Raymond was paranoid." And I felt my stomach twist because that is the oldest trick in the book. When someone exposes your actions, call them crazy. When someone brings receipts, call them jealous. Gordon leaned back and asked the question that mattered, the one that sliced through all the soap opera fog. Where did the money in that account come from? Renee stared at him, and Paige, my sister, suddenly spoke from the corner of the room where she'd been quiet, arms folded, eyes wide, like she wasn't sure whose side to stand on now that the ground was moving, and she said, "Mom, what is he talking about?" And Renee whipped toward her daughter and said, "Not now, Paige." And Paige flinched, like she'd heard that tone 1,000 times and still never got used to it. Gordon turned to Paige gently and said, "I'm not blaming you, but you deserve to know what your mother has been doing." Renee's eyes flashed at me and she hissed, "This is your fault." And I finally stepped around Mason enough for her to see my face and I said, "No, Renee, your choices are your fault. You don't get to rob someone and then scream when they stop smiling." If you're watching and you've ever been raised to believe family loyalty means swallowing your pain to keep a parent comfortable, I want you to answer me honestly, because it matters. At what point does loyalty turn into self-betrayal? Gordon's voice got quieter, which is what real anger looks like in responsible men, and he said, "Did you take Tessa's inheritance?" Renee laughed once, sharp. "Fake. Inheritance, oh my God." And she started talking fast. "There were expenses, there were bills. You don't understand how hard it was after Raymond died." And Colleen cut in. "The funeral was $8,500, Renee, and Tessa paid $2,000 of that." And Renee turned to Colleen like she wanted to burn her with her eyes. "You should have minded your business." And Colleen's shoulders rose, then settled, and she said, "It was my business when you threatened me and stole from her." Gordon looked at me then, like he needed the final confirmation from the person whose life got bulldozed, and I didn't dramatize it, I didn't wail, I didn't beg. I said the truth the way you say the weather. State Farm confirmed both checks were issued and cashed in April 2021. I never saw mine. I confronted her, and she paid me $31,500 on December 19th. She told you it was dental surgery. Paige's mouth opened slightly and she whispered, "Mom," like she was 8 years old again. Renee spun back to Gordon and tried to regain control with a sob. "I did it for the family." And Gordon nodded like he understood, and then he said something that made my heart stop. "No, you did it for you." Silence. The kind that makes the whole room feel like it lost oxygen. And then Gordon did something Renee wasn't prepared for.
He didn't yell.
He didn't curse. He didn't bargain. He pulled his phone out, opened his notes app, and started listing questions like he was conducting an audit, because that's what this was now, a moral audit. How much is in the separate account? When was it opened? Whose name is on it? Where did the deposits originate? How many other withdrawals have been made? Have taxes been filed correctly? Have you lied on any financial disclosures? Renee looked at him like he'd turned into a stranger, and she said, "You're humiliating me." And Gordon said, "You humiliated yourself when you lied to everyone in this room." Mason squeezed my hand once, and I realized my hands were shaking, not from fear, from the adrenaline of finally watching consequences show up for someone who never thought they'd have to pay. Renee's voice went sharp again. "If you leave me over this, you'll regret it." And Gordon answered, "I already regret the years I spent believing you." And then he turned to me and said, "I'm sorry you were left alone after your accident." And that sentence, that simple decency, made something in my chest unclench that I didn't realize I'd been holding tight since the hospital. Renee tried one last play, the nuclear one. She pointed at me and said, "She's jealous. She's always wanted what Paige has." And I laughed, and it came out dry, almost surprised, and I said, "What I wanted was a mother who would show up when I couldn't walk. What I wanted was not to be lied to for 3 years. What I wanted was my father's last act of love, not to be turned into your private slush fund." Gordon closed the folder, stood up, and said, "I'm leaving for the night." And Renee jolted. "Where are you going?" And he said, "A hotel. And tomorrow I'm speaking to an attorney." Paige started crying then. Not pretty crying, confused crying, like her whole identity was built on Mom being the hero, and now she wasn't sure who she was in the story. Renee tried to pull Paige to her side. "Baby, I did everything for you." And Paige pulled away slightly, and that tiny motion was a crack in their alliance. Gordon walked to the door, paused, and looked at me again. "Do you want me to tell anyone else, or do you want privacy?" And I thought about it, and I said, "Tell the truth to whoever asks. I'm done protecting lies." Gordon nodded once and left. Renee stood there breathing hard, like she was deciding whether to collapse or attack, and she chose attack. She looked at me and said, "You've ruined my life." And I leaned forward just a little and said, "You ruined your life when you chose a cruise over your granddaughter." And here's the part that surprised even me. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean, like I'd finally washed off a guilt that was never mine. We left Colleen's house a few minutes later, and outside the air was cold and sharp, the kind of cold that makes you feel awake, and in the car Mason didn't say much. He just drove, and when we got home I checked on Callie first, because that's what real priorities look like, not Facebook captions about self-care, but a quiet house where your baby is safe. The next morning, my phone was full of messages, some from relatives I barely talked to, some from Paige, some from Renee, and you already know what the messages sounded like, because families like this always use the same vocabulary. "Why are you doing this? We can move past it. You're tearing us apart. You're being dramatic." And I want you watching to tell me in the comments, especially if you're in your 60s or 70s and you've seen this play out in your own family, when someone steals and lies and favors one child over another, who actually tears the family apart, the person who did it or the person who finally exposed it. I did 2 things that day, and I'm telling you because this is the moral lesson part nobody teaches you until you've paid for it in pain. I opened a college account for Callie, and I put every penny of that recovered inheritance into it, because my father's love deserved a clean landing spot. And then I went to my bank app and blocked any automatic transfers to Renee's account. Permanently, no dramatic announcement, no long speech. Just a quiet, adult boundary. Renee texted me, "You'll regret this." And for the first time in my life, I believed the opposite. Because regret isn't refusing to be used. Regret is the years you spend subsidizing someone else's disrespect. Weeks later, I heard through the grapevine that Gordon filed, that Renee told everyone she was blindsided, that Paige tried to play both sides until she realized there was no both sides, when the truth is written in bank ink, and Colleen, the woman who used to be terrified of being erased, started hosting Sunday dinners again with a smaller table and a lighter heart. And me, I healed. Not just my leg, not just my shoulder, but that old wound where you keep hoping a parent will become the person you needed. Some people don't change. They just get exposed. If you've stayed with me this far, I want you to do two things right now. Tell me in the comments if Renee crossed the line, and tell me what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have confronted her, cut her off, forgiven her, or taken the money and disappeared? And then keep watching, because the next story on your screen is the one you need if you've ever been guilt-tripped into silence. It'll show you exactly how to set boundaries without turning into the villain they keep trying to
Paint you as.